All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Salt and Light podcast, where we talk about all things life and Jesus. And unfortunately, today we are Kurtless. We have no Kurt.
Yep, it's a little sad.
He's a little hung up right now, and he can't make it for very legitimate reasons.
So he says in his text message. He said it's super legit. That's what he
super legit. Too legit to quit.
That's right.
Yeah. But I guess it was legit enough to quit. So I guess that doesn't make sense. But Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I miss Kurt. We left his chair empty as a memoriam, which is kind of fun.
We should have put something there.
I know.
If we had more time, we could get like one of those big cutouts.
That's right.
Those fat head cutouts and put like a big Kurt there.
That would be pretty awesome, especially if we got it in like multiple levels. Like it's a cardboard, so it actually sits in the chair.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, kind of like have it like creased at certain points and whatnot.
Yeah. But no, I'm doing good. I'm excited. I think it'll be fun. What's funny, I was thinking about this as we were getting ready to come over and record because I knew it would just be the two of us. And I was like, man, it is amazing sometimes how, like, I remember before I was on staff and we would hang out.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking when I was like, oh, we'll be on staff, like we'll hang out all the time, which you do see each other probably a lot more than if I didn't work here. But it is amazing how, the role and the responsibilities, we're in a lot of meetings together, but like we don't really get a ton of time at work, at least to sit down and chat. Yeah.
We actually hung out more outside of work when we weren't working together, which is interesting.
Yep.
But you were not everybody knows Jake's history, but you were on the young adult worship team, but you're on the main stage worship team as well. But you were like the primary person for young adults the first Thursday of every month during the young adult gathering. You were holding it down, doing the worship for those.
Yeah.
And so we would probably meet like when you're volunteering here once a month at least.
For sure. And
I would drive over to Mercy Hospital on State Street and come say hi. By the way, the security there, I don't think it's not a hospital anymore, right?
Not the State Street location. No, they're all
it
down
apartments
at Fall River.
now?
I think so. It's like some sort of elderly or assisted living.
Yeah, I thought I heard there's like living there.
Yeah.
But I remember I would like drive in and then I'd just be like, Jake, radiology. And they'd be like, okay, cool. And I'd just like walk right through.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd kind of like meander my way around. Sometimes I would get lost the first few times of like trying to find your office.
Yeah. Yeah, especially I remember getting like, if you get lost in the stairwells, because it's like 5 floors or whatever, or maybe 6 with the basement. So you get like, if you get in the stairwell and you don't know which floor you're going to, and you come out and it's just a maze of rooms and hallways. But
do you miss those days at all working there? It was a little bit of a dungeon, if I may say so, respectfully. Like, not probably a whole lot of natural light.
No, definitely not. I mean, in doing ultrasound, you're usually like in the dark,
right?
Or in radiology mostly. But
were you doing a lot of hands-on ultrasounds with people yourself, or were you kind of overseeing the department, or?
Yeah, initially when I got hired on there, it was coming right out of being a student, and then I got hired on there and was a staff sonographer. So I just like had my own schedule of patients and do ER patients and inpatients, all that. And then the supervisor that was on when that hired me ended up leaving for a different job and recommended me for the position. So I ended up becoming the supervisor there. So then I was in administration. I still scanned quite a bit, so I still did a lot of hands-on, but more to help cover, or if there were call-outs, like their patients became my patients. But it was a lot more like administration, which I'd say I enjoyed doing ultrasound, and I had a good staff there that I enjoyed working with. The people at Mercy were really great, but I don't miss certainly like hospital administration and like I worked with insurance companies a lot, and they're like, I can't speak for everybody who works for those companies, but as a whole, I saw a really dark, slimy side of healthcare, which wasn't really fun.
Yeah.
So I don't miss it. And we talk about it a lot.
Does that change your approach as more on the patient side? of how you approach like going about care, or like ways that you like approach going to the doctors or things like that? Has that changed at all?
A little bit, yeah. I think you're kind of like in the know with some little things, like, oh, if you ask for this or go about it this way, or sometimes it's a bad thing because it'll like, well, they're not going to do anything if I go in for this reason.
Be more like cynical or jaded.
Yeah, I'm not going to go in. But no, I think definitely knowing a little bit about, you know, how charges and costs work, like for CPT coding and stuff.
Yeah,
you can know. And I used to try to be transparent with patients as much as possible without getting us in trouble. But, you know, sometimes people would be in the dark about things and they would get like ripped off.
Yeah.
Not because of the people working at the hospital, but the way the billing on the back end was with insurance, you know, and it was just like horrible to see like some, you know, single mom or some like young or old person just like not able to afford it and just getting totally bulldozed by the system. You know,
it's
that
terrible.
was horrible.
It definitely seems like one of those systems where it's kind of an unfortunate snowball effect that gets created where you can tell the hospitals, they sometimes might raise their prices to match what the insurance costs because they know how much insurance will pay for it. And then it'll they'll almost like, it's like they're out drinking each other at the bar. They'll just keep like raising their prices or whatnot. And then insurance will match it and then going back and forth. And so you realize like, if you don't have good insurance and you're just trying to pay for anything in our medical system, just out of pocket.
Oh yeah.
You're just in
it's brutal.
Big trouble. Cause the prices are not catered towards like, the average person's budget or ability to afford. It's all
so
based
blown out of
around
proportion.
How much insurance companies will pay.
Yeah.
And you can see now why like insurance companies, they'll like fight hospitals around charges and different things like that as well.
Yeah.
Because they know that the hospitals are raising their prices potentially.
Yeah. And not to keep talking about this because we'll move on pretty
This doesn't
quickly.
really have to do much with Jesus, guys. We'll get to the Jesus stuff, guys. Don't worry.
But I remember...
but this is justice.
This is justice. Maybe or injustice.
Yeah, and we're talking
Jesus
about the need for justice.
Yes. Yeah. I remember meeting... So I had a patient. I met a patient one day, and I asked, you know, because you spend like 45 minutes with people for their appointments. And I remember asking him, like, oh, what do you do for work? And he told me that he was a physician and that he works for the insurance company. And I was like, oh, tell me about that. And he was pretty, like, jaded and transparent about it. Like, I could tell he didn't think he didn't have rose-colored glasses. He, like, really knew what was going on. And he was explaining to me that the insurance companies literally hire a full staff of doctors and nurses to find the loopholes and like things to like get more money out of the hospitals and patients.
Wow.
And even worse, that team finds ways to deny patient claims. So like they'll find every and any way to deny a claim so that the insurance company doesn't have to pay.
That's awful.
And I was like, I don't like that. Like, and I kind of knew that from my experience.
Right.
But to hear it firsthand with no like delusion of it, it was like, oh, this is such a
system that needs to be reformed for sure. Yeah.
So
big time. So
I think, you know, one big thing, because we were talking about hanging out beforehand, I think season of life has just really changed for both of us. We're both dads, and you're a girl dad. I got some boys. And so now we get to hang out as families, which is so cool. Like you like look back years ago, and then we would have never probably thought it would be the way like God drew it up, you know?
No, I could never have thought it would kind of arrive in this place. Only God could write the story the way it's been written. Which, speaking of writing stories, yesterday, so we have our Discovery Point group on Sundays, which is kind of our first steps group here in the church. That last semester I kind of was creating the curriculum and beta tested it, and now we have like a full-fledged
this is the
run.
Full first run.
Yeah. So it's pretty cool. But part of it, kind of like starting point, what we used to do here is we have people share their stories in the group, And so this past Sunday, we didn't have church because of the snowstorm. This upcoming Sunday, I'm not sure if we're going to have church or not. Like we'll see. But I usually go first in sharing my story.
Yep.
And in the past, I've kind of like winged it a little bit, you know, because I'm just like, I know my story. But this go around, it's been cool because yesterday I spent some time and I just like wrote my story out. And it was really just a spiritually satisfying process where like by the end of it, I was almost to the point of tears of just like the goodness of God in my life, cool. Like his faithfulness.
Yeah.
And the ways that he's kind of just written my story and taken me from one step to the next. And I was just on the phone with my mom last night talking about it a little bit. And I said, you know, sometimes, and we've talked about this before, it can really be easy to kind of come into our work here and just think of it as another day of work and forget like this is what God has called us to.
Right.
Like he's called us into this position to do his will, you know, and it's not just a job, it's a calling, you know, and he's designed us and wired us for these purposes. And it was just, it was an encouraging thing for me in only a way that God could like really meet me, you know?
Yeah.
But I would encourage that for anyone just listening at home. Like if you haven't just written out your story in a while, and more so from not like a memoir, like a full auto, because that could take a really long time, but more just from like a testimonial perspective, like how has God moved in your life and what's his thread of how he's kind of just moved in your life and brought you into a relationship with him. And doing that is just, I think, a really important thing for us to do as Christians.
Yeah.
And I think when you do that as well, when you write it out, at least when I was writing it out, it helps me, like when I write something out, it helps me clarify my thoughts around it more versus if I'm just trying to tell the story out loud.
Sure. Or you pick up on like more details.
Like
more ties, I think.
Yeah. I was able to be more thorough, I think. And I wasn't just like kind of like jumping from one thing to the next. I was able to be more thorough and just kind of make it more clear in my mind. So, it was really, edifying for me.
Yeah. I don't remember if it was on the podcast or in group, but I remember a few weeks ago, talking about it, and it's, what you just were sharing makes me think of like the practice that we don't really do as Christians now, that the like Israelites, the ancient Israelites did, which was like, they were very, very intentional to write down, make songs about, and then like share stories of God's faithfulness from generation to generation to generation. And I don't know what the like cultural reason, and maybe we do in our own way, but it certainly doesn't like, I don't sit down or haven't really sat down and done that other than, you know, because of like Jordan and I's journey through like going to Colorado and back, probably more than the average person, I've been like asked about it or had to share my story from like all the way back of like my upbringing through and things like this, like the podcast.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, I have actually gotten to see how sharing it, because what you said about like, you know, you're almost in tears thinking about your own story, which like doesn't really make sense at first. But if you've done it, like even as I will sit and maybe I grab coffee with somebody that is new in my life or like somebody that goes here and asks to meet, when I like recount my story to them, it does like bring up the gratitude and the emotions. Like you almost relive it or get like another bout of like gratitude and thankfulness towards God for all that he's done, especially when you start to recap it with knowing the thread. Because I think, you know, most people can look back and think of a moment or two that God's been faithful. Yeah. But when you look at things like holistically, you look at a timeline and you start to see all the different ways he's moved to get you to where you are. And both looking at the times that we've been obedient and surrendered and the outcomes to that, as well as when we've been rebellious and stubborn, and then the outcomes to that. And you really see that he is a merciful and gracious God and blesses us way beyond what we deserve.
I know. It's so true.
And that, I think, is encouraging to move us into further obedience and surrender forward. It'd be very hard to just like will yourself into obedience and surrender.
Yeah.
But when you look back, it's easier, I think.
Yeah. And God meets us exactly where we're at. He knows how forgetful we are, you know, like you look at a classic example of that in scripture with the Exodus story, and the Israelites, they see the Egyptian nation come crumbling down, you know, through all the plagues and the wonders that God does there in Egypt. And they're just like these tremendous things, culminating with Moses putting his staff in the Red Sea and the entire thing splitting in half, you know, and they're walking through a dry land, and then it closes up over, you know, the Pharaoh's army as he's chasing after them. And then only a couple pages go by and they're already grumbling, and they're like, things were better when we were in Egypt. Yeah. They're just like forgetting God's faithfulness. Like, is he going to just like leave us out here to die? Right. You know, just forgetting all of these amazing, you know, breaking of the laws of physics that only the God of the universe could do just a couple pages before.
The manna, the quail.
That's how we are, though. Oh, you know, 100%. Like that's our nature. And I think like that's why God encourages in the Old Testament the patriarchs to make altars when there's a special moment where God makes a covenant, or they're reminded of his faithfulness, or he does something special, like make an altar here to remember what I've done, remember my promise. And I think it's for them, and I think it's also for their generations past to come, you know, to know like, oh, this is where God made the promise with my great-great-great-grandpa, you know, Abraham, that we would be his people. And kind of speaking of that, so my great-grandpa on my mom's side, his name's Wally Harris. He's passed now. He was born in 1907. So he was a reverend here in South Portland.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And so I don't know too much of his story, but he was a reverend in a congregational church. But this is back when they were like based, before they kind of went like super woke and like don't even really believe the Bible anymore. Yeah. But anyways, he had this moment where God reaffirmed his calling for him. And he preached this message, and he carved, it was like in a woodshed, and like he carved this plaque out and then painted it. And it's like this plaque, it's in my office. I think you've seen it. It's hanging up over my desk. I could have brought it in and showed everybody, but I wasn't expecting to share this. But it's like you see the Portland headlight in the background, and you see him, and he's like kneeling over in like this woodshed, and on the ground is this wooden cross in the picture. And it's this moment where like God's reaffirming his calling in his life. Now, this is really crazy. This is how God used this in my life. My senior year of college, I was coming back home over Christmas break. And, you know, it's like a month-long Christmas break. And I was actually planning, like Scott asked me to preach the Sunday after Christmas, which is kind of notoriously like a Sunday that not a lot of people go to, but to me, it was a really big deal, you know, and I was like super honored, but I was kind of like spiritually a little bit on E at the time. And a big part of that was because in hindsight, there's a lot of areas in my life that I hadn't really fully surrendered over to God that I have now. Sure. And so I was starting to feel like really shaky in my calling and borderline, like, I don't know if ministry's for me. Yeah. And that Christmas Eve, my auntie Jen, who lives in Dixfield, Maine, came over, and she comes over on, you know, Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff like that. And we're not like super close. And she's not like this like super prayerful Christian. Like, I don't even really know if she's a believer in Jesus. I think she is. A lot of her like cards she gives me has like, God loves you, you know, but like, she doesn't really talk about it. She's kind of like wears her cards close to her chest or whatever. So she pulls out this plaque and gives it to me and tells me, this is your great-grandpa Wallace, and he was a reverend for like the majority of his life. And this is a moment where God reaffirmed his calling in his life, and I just wanted to give it to you.
Oh, wow.
And I broke down in tears. And she was like, I could take it back if you want me to. And I was like, no, please don't take it back. You couldn't take it from my dead body.
Right,
like you don't know how much this means to me in this moment. But it was like this moment where only God can write that story, where it's like, he's now passed, but he created this altar for himself.
Right.
That then was an altar for me in the moment I needed it, where I thought, I'm going to go be like a real estate agent or do something else. I'm going to go into business. And God reaffirmed my calling in that moment through that plaque, that was given to me in that moment when I crucially needed it.
Yeah.
And then I got to preach at East Point for the first time that following Sunday. And like, God just like filled my tank up after that. And I'm sure it was like a very like subpar message I gave, but to me, I was like, I knocked that out of the park, because I felt so filled with purpose and the Holy Spirit that like, this is the path that God wants me to go on.
Yeah.
And so
that's a wild
you never
story.
know how God's going to use like an altar.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, sometimes we discredit. I remember being in different classes. Like I've been through Starting Point, like way back when Jordan and I were first getting engaged and in the church, and I've been through like Rooted and all those different classes, and so in men's groups and things like that. And you hear people share their or what they believe to be their test. You go around and I'm like, I love that we say share your story now,
right?
Because oftentimes people will say like share your testimony. And I think people's understanding of what that is a little off. It's a little skewed.
Right.
Like they think it's tell us how you came to know Jesus, which is equally as important and a great testimony. But your testimony is being written all the time. Like what God is doing in and through you all the time. Like if you had something, if the Holy Spirit spoke to you this morning, that is part of your testimony.
Right.
And it happens. It's ever changing and ever growing.
Right.
But I think as I heard people share their story over and over and over again, I remember seeing people feeling very, like embarrassed, maybe a little bit, very like, not confident in them sharing their story and what you could tell. And sometimes they would just come out and say it, but they felt like their story was insignificant in God's kingdom and that it wouldn't help anyone to hear it.
Right.
And it wasn't worth them sharing it. And I remember, and now I feel even more strongly about this, that it can be so encouraging, almost equally as encouraging as me looking back at my own story, as hearing you share one about you or somebody else sharing theirs, because it's the same God being faithful as he has been for me with somebody else. And so it's almost like just this, like culmination of all these stories of God's, like, I think, and that's part of the goal of this podcast. Even we talked about that before, like Christian evangelism, like spurring one another on, like heating the coals. And I think if a bunch of Christians sat in a room and just shared stories of God's faithfulness, they would all be edified. Like everybody would get something out of that. Yeah. And I think that's why we value life groups so highly. Yeah. And because prayerfully, that's part of what's happening. It's not solely one person teaching information to other people. That can be valuable, but there's so much more than that. It's the sharing, it's the altar moments, it's the almost the hymns and songs of his faithfulness, not maybe out loud like that, but it's just this retelling over and over of his faithfulness. Yeah. Because like you said, as we look at, Exodus and all these like stories of the Israelites, we can like roll our eyes at how God fed them with manna one moment, and then they said, are we going to starve? We don't have water to drink. Yeah. The next moment. And to us, it's just one page. Like we read it on the previous page, but for them, it was 40, 50 years, maybe longer than that.
Maybe a few weeks.
Maybe
at that point in time.
For that story in particular, but sometimes
it became 40 years.
Yeah. And there was, on some of them, there was big gaps. And I look at how I can have these seasons of obedience and faithfulness, and then seasons of selfishness and distraction.
Yeah.
And that can be all, I can have multiple of those within a year's time.
Oh yeah.
You know, we're so, we can be so manipulated and entranced by our flesh and by 100%. The world.
Yeah.
That it's so important to keep remembering, what God's done.
Yeah.
But sometimes we just forget to do that, you know?
Yeah. And on that note of people sometimes being ashamed to share their story, like I can resonate with that, because I think a lot of people want to have a story. They gravitate to the stories that get platformed in a way that's like, you know, this story has 5 million views on YouTube, and look at this guy. He was like a sociopath, and he was like murderous, and he was like on a biker gang, and he did every drug under the sun, and then God radically just smacked him and transformed his life, and now he's like a walking testimony. He's a walking billboard of the power of God, you know?
Yeah.
And I think like there's a lot of us that we kind of almost want to have that story where you're like, and sometimes you even see it with people where they almost try to make their past sound like worse than it is, which can sometimes be a little cringy. And I've done that too before. But for me, I think like a good framework that I've kind of looked at it in is like, you look at like Luke 15, Jesus tells the story of the lost son, the prodigal son. And you have, and I think so you have two sons. You have the younger brother and you have the older brother. We all know the younger brother, he takes the dad's inheritance, runs off, squanders the wealth, eats with the pigs, comes to a sentence, runs home. His dad just embraces him and gives him forgiveness, right? When he doesn't deserve it. And it's like a perfect depiction of grace in the gospel, right? Of what we all know is true and what Jesus did for us when he died for our sins. But then you have like the older brother. And I think a lot of people forget about the older brother who's sitting out in the field while the party's going on, and his dad comes out to him and he goes, "What are you doing? Like, why aren't you celebrating with all of our family and friends? Like, your brother's home." And in that moment, you see all of this false motivation that the older brother had that's exposed, of like the selfishness and resentment that he has when he says, all these years I've been with you and you haven't given me as much as a goat, you know, to go party with my friends. And I love the father's response. He says, "You've been with me this whole time and everything I have is yours." You know? So let's go celebrate your brother. Like basically saying like, if you had asked me, I would have given you anything you wanted. But you could tell the older brother, he thought he was like working and deserving of his father's presence and the grace that he was getting, the things that he was getting, when he realized, oh, it didn't have anything to do with my works. It has everything to do with who my dad is, you know, and his nature. It doesn't have to do with me. And that's like that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes as Christians, like when you've grown up in the church, because that's kind of similar to my story. Where you're kind of like, I thought I was earning this, you know, why have I been so good this whole time? Like I could have been like running off and doing whatever my fleshly desires wanted to do, and you still would have loved me. And you realize, oh, it's not about that. And just to kind of tie this in, like this past weekend, I went to 4th Street, a restaurant down in downtown Portland. Have you heard of 4th Street before? 4th Street and Company. So I used to work at the hotel next to 4th Street, the Hilton Garden Inn. And I had talked about 4th Street so many times as a front desk agent there, where they're like, any good recommendations? I was like, yeah, you should go to 4th Street. It's so good, farm to table. They're the flagship restaurant of Portland, you know, like they're the best. And I'd walked by a million times. I talked about it a million times. This was actually the first time I ever actually ate there. This past Friday with my wife. And I got in and it was amazing. I smelled the smells. I experienced, you know, the atmosphere, and I ate the food and it was so good. And it's kind of a little preachy and maybe a little like, you can see where I'm going, but I knew about 4th Street, but now I know 4th Street.
Yeah. You've experienced it,
And I think that's kind of like how God's transformed me in my relationship with Jesus. I grew up in the church as a pastor's kid.
Yeah.
I knew Jesus. I could talk about Jesus.
Right.
I even read about him. But now I feel like I know Jesus. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's something that he's unfolding to me as like this unlimited wellspring of life that I feel like he's just kind of gushing out and he's like, taste and see, you know, the Lord is good, you know? So, but I think a lot of people, we forget that's just as valid of a testimony in the older brother as someone who is the younger brother who runs off and tastes every type of ice cream that's out there, every flavor of sin, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then comes back home. That's not my story, but.
And I am right there with you because I felt the exact same way. I experienced the same thing, grew up in the church. And at the time, I think it's also, you don't know what you don't know. I think at times I even had myself convinced that I like was experiencing Jesus, maybe, but I definitely felt something was missing. And so it was all that. It was the knowledge of him. I knew the stories. I did the things, and it was like empty, you know, comparatively. And then, you know, now I can say, oh, I've experienced him and what a massive world-changing difference that is. And so I feel a big part of my mission, the plans and the work that God has for me, is to share that with people who have a similar experience as I do, because I needed that. And that was huge for me. And so, no, I don't have like the, you know, drug dealer to preacher story or whatever. And
although you kind of could look the part.
Yeah, well, I've heard that. Yeah,
Get a couple
like, you weren't in a gang,
know?
you know, you weren't in a biker gang. I'm like, no, I'm way too soft. If you really knew me, I could never make it.
It's like that scene in Tangled when she goes and there's like all these like burly guys. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know.
Like, I have a dream.
Oh yeah.
And they all just like start like
singing
and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm definitely soft that way. But no, I think it's so important. And as you were sharing the prodigal son story, like I think about that sometimes with parenting, because I was listening to a couple pastors on a podcast talking about parenting, and they were talking about the things that they do to help lead their children to Jesus. And a big thing that they kept repeating and kept focusing on were the world will tell you, and even other parents will tell you, you don't want your kids to miss out. And they're like, you want them to miss out. If you're a good parent and you're trying to lead them to Jesus, there are things you want them to miss out on.
Yeah.
And that's important.
Yes.
But it's also hard because nobody wants to feel like they're missing out.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's the better choice. And I think about like the things that I may keep my kids from, that the world and other kids will tell them that they're missing out on.
Right.
And I get a lot of I get a lot of peace and comfort from what you said, like the father's response, because I can look and know about my kids that God says to them, don't you know that all I have is yours?
Right.
So no matter what they miss out on in this life, if they choose to follow him, and I pray feverishly that they do, because it's out of my control completely. But I just pray that they would know and understand that all he has for them is theirs if they choose. And so it's like, man, what a cool, like, that parable is so intricate and so deep and so
super
amazing.
Deep. A lot of layers to it.
Yeah. And we always focus on the one layer, and it's an important layer. It's very, not to nullify like that part of it. The prodigal son is, and some people really need that part of the story. But for me and for like raising a family, that response from the father is so important.
And I think every one of us has a little bit of both brothers in us. You know what I mean? Because like you can't be saved without that prodigal son moment, because we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we all have to have a reckoning moment where we look in the mirror and we go, wow, I have a lot of sin in my life and I can't fix it on my own. And I have problems that I can't solve and I can't fix. And only Jesus can do that for me, you know? And so I think we all have that like younger brother moment in our life.
Yeah.
I think some people more to higher extremes, and that's more overt than other people, but you can't be saved if you've never had the younger brother moment.
Right.
But I think some of us relate more to the older brother than others, especially if you've been in the church the majority of your life, and you relate to that feeling like you might be missing out on some of the things that the world is celebrating and says, this is awesome, everyone needs to try this thing out, you know? And you're like, ooh, is it? I'm really trusting you, Jesus, that's not the case.
Right.
But I think the beautiful thing is when you're like just in the river with the Spirit and you're just enjoying the Spirit's presence, you never have a second thought of, oh, is there something else that's better than this? Because you're like, this is amazing. I think where FOMO really starts to get you is when you're starting to live in religion, you know,
yeah, for sure.
and duty.
Yeah.
And I think that was how my middle school years were characterized. Like I remember when I got baptized and I was like, okay, I'm actually going to be a disciple of Jesus. I'm going to follow Jesus and I'm going to live for him. I remember it was almost like I saw sin more in my life, and I sinned more the following year after that, because it was almost kind of like, it was like Satan kind of was around the corner like, oh, really? You're going to follow Jesus and you're going to do it on your own strength.
Right.
Like, we'll see about that. And so kind of like what Paul says in Romans 7, the law just exposed sin more, and in some ways made the sin more enticing to me.
Right.
But then it wasn't until I got into like high school when like God brought really godly friends in my life who I was really able to like kind of enjoy hanging out with on the weekends and spend time with and feel safe. And we weren't drinking or we weren't worried about like promiscuity or anything like that. Like that's when I felt like I was like, oh, this is rich and abundant life. Like this is what God has for me. And I didn't think twice, is anyone having more fun than I'm having right now?
Right.
You know? And then with that too, I think God deepened me in a level of just recognizing like, hey, if you're making this about the do's and don'ts, what you should do and what you shouldn't do, you're going to fail really fast. Like you got to beeline for his presence and use that as your source of strength so that you don't just stumble and fall because you're relying on your own power. And that's actually something that I feel like I've just begun to realize on a really deep level in like the last 5 years of like, you have to make it about the bullseye of Jesus. And you have to go all in on that, because if you're trying to live it in a way that's like, oh, I'm managing a holy life and you start to get the yeast of the Pharisees and that religion in your life, you just start to see sin everywhere. And then it becomes more and more appealing for you.
No, 100%. I think like the Romans is coming to mind about like even our best efforts are like filthy rags, like even our good deeds. And I think if we knew, and as we begin to learn the truth, like in Luke when Jesus has the woman comes and he says she loves much because she's been forgiven much. The reality is we've all been forgiven much because we've all sinned much. But it's she's aware of her sin.
Right.
And that's the big difference is I think at the core of it, we're all like the younger brother. We've all like, even what we would consider our good deeds and our good life, maybe growing up in the church, compared to what living a surrendered, obedient life to Jesus is, the things that I was focused on my whole life were like slop. Was me going off and doing my own thing. Because whether it was like drugs or it was distraction and selfishness or it was, this or that, it doesn't matter.
Right. Anything
apart from him is just worthless.
Yeah, it's void.
And so it's like, no, at the core of it, we're all the younger brother. But I think the analogy obviously is to encourage on the other side. Then when it's almost Jesus's grace that reinstates us as the older brother And it's by his grace that we get to be the older brother. And then that's the encouragement to being the older brother is more of like a life set apart that you don't look back to say, well, why did he get to do this and I don't get to do it?
Right.
It's more of the encouragement to that to say, all I have is yours.
Yeah, don't fall back into a paradigm of works and think you're earning it.
Right.
Right, because that's the older brother, right? He's like, I've been working hard. I've been sticking around here. I'm faithful to you, Dad. And he's like, thank you. And by the way, like, you have my presence, and if you asked for it, I would give you, any goat to go have a party with your friends. Trying to think of a comparable analogy to nowadays. Chuck E. Cheese, But he's thinking, oh, I'm working hard for it, and I'm waiting for my pat on the back. And the dad's kind of like, I think you're missing the paradigm here. You're falling back into that. Yeah. I'm earning it. This is a works paradigm. Yeah. Versus the dad's, I think, trying to show them both. This is all about my grace. Right. And my love for you guys. Well, and your identity as sons.
That's it. I think that's the big piece is I think in his response, he doesn't say, because of your faithfulness, all I have is yours. Yeah. It's, you're my son. Right. Because of who you are and who I am. Right. Everything I have is yours. And that's the big distinction. Right. Is it's dangerous for us to think because we aren't at the strip club or at, the meth lab or whatever, because we're in church on Sunday, God loves us more and we're entitled to inheritance. Right. That is so not the truth. Like we get to do those things and we get to experience more of him now because of those things, but it's because of who he is and who he reinstates us to be that we get to experience that.
And that's the biggest thing that Jesus ruffles the Jewish people's feathers on, with whether it's the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. But what comes to my mind is like when he goes back to his hometown in Nazareth and they ask him to preach at the synagogue, and The Chosen actually does a really good job depicting this. And he goes back and then he reads Isaiah 61 where he's like, the Spirit of the Lord's on me. He's anointed me to do all these things. And he's like, this is fulfilled in your presence. And the people are like, oh, they're kind of amazed by what he's saying. Like, this is really interesting. And then he's like, but I know what you're going to say next. You're going to say, physician, heal yourself. Quote the proverb to me. And you're going to want to test me to see a sign. And then, because he's like, because you feel entitled to do that because you're Jews and you're children of God. But then he almost like, it's like, Jesus, this was probably not the most strategic thing to say next for winning friends and influencing people. Because he goes, but think of the widow in Elijah's day. He visited a woman in Zarephath in Sidon, which is like Syria, a pagan woman. Yeah. And for 2 years, or he says 3 years, there was a famine in the land. He could have gone to any Israelite woman, but he went to that woman. And then he goes, or think of how Elijah healed Naaman, a Syrian, of his leprosy in that day and age. He could have healed many peoples. There was lots of lepers. He could have healed all of them. And at that point, they're like, okay, those are fighting words, bro. And they literally wanted to kill him after that, you know? Because I think what he was trying to say is what we're getting at here is he was saying, like, you're not entitled to any of God's good gifts because you think you're in like a special camp or you think you're earning it. That's not who God is. It's all about his grace and his love for you. And it's about your identity as children, but it's not something that you can earn or necessarily deserve. Just like those pagan, Naaman or the widow in Sidon, they weren't Jews, but God loves them still. Right. So there's no like elite class. Right.
Which you could imagine, and this is why I think the parable of the prodigal son like probably hit home for them really hard, was you can imagine if you're a Jew in that culture and you've dedicated your life to the temple and to the rules and to all those things, and you kept yourself from all those things, all works-based, how much that would like trigger you to hear like, you're saying all this was like pointless. Like I missed it, Yeah. They like literally dedicated their life to it. Yeah. And so it's but at the root of that's pride, a misunderstanding, like but yeah, I think, boy, and I think,
which you could probably, like, if you're Jesus's disciples, you probably, it was probably really hard, especially if you were like a people pleaser, because of like Jesus is like kind of antagonizing a little bit sometimes, where he's like, you think you're sons of God because of XYZ, but you're not.
Yeah.
And God knows your heart.
Out of the rocks. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're probably just like,
do you have to say it
Jesus,
like
say
that?
it less. This is kind of scary. Like,
yeah, unless you're Peter, and he's probably like, yeah, get him, tell him.
Yeah. It's like, this is their entire identity.
Yeah.
But this is what they live for.
I mean, look at our culture, and maybe, I think I wasn't aware of like a lot of like Christian culture in the Christian world before being in ministry. I think you become a little bit more aware of like, the Christian influencers on YouTube and the pastors and all the scandals and all those things. And I think, boy, I know that there are a lot of quote unquote Christians that would be very triggered if they understood the real heart behind the prodigal son story. Like that would read their mail and they would not like it because they do. They feel like they are entitled to more of God's kingdom. Right. When in reality, they have to look at the fact that, they've fallen so short. Like they're not earning anything.
Right.
It's a gift. It's a free gift.
Yeah. And while that's being said, there's definitely a type of favor, if you want to call it that, and a blessing to living in God's will.
Oh, of course.
That like the older son took for granted and the younger son didn't realize until he didn't have it.
Right.
And he was eating with the pigs and the slop, know, and you realize, God's ways really are best for me.
Right.
But it's so true. It's not something that you can necessarily wear as a badge of pride for yourself because you're just kind of like, yeah, God is good and his grace is all over my life. And because of that, maybe I have a healthy marriage or my children are doing well, or, I've been able to keep a job and stay sober or whatever it might be. I have a lot of joy in his presence, because his spirit is inside of me. But that's a blessing and favor that comes from him. And we can't ever mistake ourselves and think that that's something that we're deserving of or that we're like working to get on our own.
Yep.
It's a gift, Yeah.
And
then we kind of just, I guess maybe we choose to keep the gift or not in a lot. That's our choice every day. Do I want to keep the gift? And do I want to stay reminded of what my true identity is? Or do I want to put the gift to the side and just kind of go dabble in what the world has to offer me?
Yeah.
It's
very true.
So how do we want to,
I think
time flies, dude. That was kind of it. Yeah.
That was fun. You want to lead us out?
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening to this episode. And we're so glad you're tuning in with us. As always, you can always reach out with your questions or comments, and you can email saltandlight@eastpoint.church. And thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.